When throwing exceptions, we can use a technique called chaining exceptions. And that basically means wrapping an exception inside a more general exception. For example, look at our withdraw method. Here we're throwing a new insufficient funds exception. But let's imagine withdrawing money could fail for different reasons. So here we could throw different kinds of exceptions. Now we can create another custom exception called account exception. And then we can wrap this exception inside an account exception. This is what we call chaining exceptions, and it's a technique that is used in building libraries and frameworks quite a lot. So we get a more general purpose exception, and then we can figure out what caused that exception. In this case, insufficient funds exception. Let me show you how this works. So first we're going to add a more general purpose exception. We call it account exception, and have it extend the exception class. Now back to our account class. Here I'm going to add a code block. Instead of throwing this exception, first I'm going to create a funds exception object. So new insufficient funds exception. Then I'm going to create an account exception and set it to new account exception. Note that we have two account exception classes here. One of them is provided by Java. The other is the one that I created earlier. So we're going to use this one. Now, we're going to say this account exception was caused by this exception. So we type account exception init cause. Now this method takes a throwable object. So we can pass an instance of the throwable class or any of its derivatives. So we can pass our funds exception object here. And then we throw our account exception. Now we have a compilation error because the signature of this method doesn't specify this exception. It's saying this method may throw an insufficient funds exception. So let's change this to account exception. The problem is gone. Now, there is a simpler way to write this code. We can go to our account exception class and add a custom constructor that takes the cause of this exception. So public account exception. Here we add a parameter of type exception called cause. Then we can use the super keyword to pass this object to one of the constructors of the base class. So as you can see, the constructor of the exception class is overloaded. We're going to use the version that takes a throwable object. So we simply pass the cause over here. Now, back to our account class. When creating an account exception, we can simply pass a new insufficient funds exception. Okay, now we don't need to create this object explicitly, which means we don't need to call the init cause method either. I introduced it earlier so you understand how things work. So let's delete. Now we don't need this variable either. We can simply throw this object. And now we can get rid of this unnecessary curly braces. So we are throwing an account exception that is caused by an insufficient funds exception. So technically we have wrapped this object inside a more general exception. Okay. Now, back to our demo class. We have a compilation error because currently we're catching an insufficient funds exception. We should change this to account exception. Now the problem is gone. Now, instead of printing the message of this exception, let's call e.print stack trace. Now run. See what we got. We got an account exception. This exception was thrown in the withdraw method over here, and it was caused by a different exception, insufficient funds exception. This is chaining exceptions in action, and it's something you may see often when building large enterprise applications. You may see an exception cause another exception, which will cause another exception, and so on. Now, this exception object has the init cause method that you saw earlier. It also has get cause, which returns a throwable. So if I want to get the cause of this exception, I can store it over here. This will give us the insufficient funds exception object. So we can print cause.getMessage, run. And now we see the insufficient funds message. So this is all about chaining exceptions.